The following is a production of Texas Lutheran University. For more information, please visit tlu.edu.
We are very fortunate today to have Michael Shearn to address TLU. And I've got to admit, I first knew about Michael because his book, The Investment Checklist, had gotten such rave reviews. And as you can tell, mine has gotten more than a little bit of use. And I found that I was very intrigued that after 20 years in the business, rarely do I pick up a book that I end up taking this many notes. Usually I take this kind of notes when I read something written by Warren Buffett, which is tremendous praise for somebody who I had never met. Then, I finally got to the back of it and I went, wait a minute, this guy lives in Austin. We need to get this guy on campus. So I started doing some Google searches, and there is zero advertising for Michael Shearn or any of his investment vehicles, which is very, very unusual. Usually the people in the investment business, they are all about advertising everything they possibly can. The only people who don't advertise are the people who are extremely secure in who they are, what they do, and they don't need to advertise. They go about their business day in and day out doing a very, very professional job. So I had written to Michael, and he was kind enough to contact me very quickly and said, yeah, I'd be interested in coming by. So I went by his office, and if you ever want to see the definition of humble, it would be Michael's office. I walk in, there's not some big screen wall of Bloombergs or anything like that. It's him and a library research assistant that do massive amounts of due diligence on any company that they're looking to invest in. It's truly just critical thinking at its best and its purest. I also think it's interesting to have Michael on campus too because his academic experience is much like ours. He went to Southwestern up in Georgetown, and I hope you don't mind me telling this story,
No.
Michael, but when he first got out of school, he said, well, I want to be a financial analyst. So he sent off resumes to all the guys on Wall Street, and none of them would talk to him. And so, sometimes I think there's a little bit of frustration coming from a small school, and certainly the folks on Wall Street don't know the good deals that they're missing out on down here. But Michael's been down those roads, and so don't be hesitant to ask him, how did you get your start? How did you get to where you are today? How did you overcome those types of hurdles? So that said, please help me welcome Michael Shearn.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Dave for inviting me here. And honestly, it was just yesterday that I saw the results from the Bulldog investment fund. And I have to tell you, I was, in all honesty, very much floored. I mean, it's a way better record than me. So in a way, I'm kind of humbled. I should be on that side, not up here. But maybe you'll learn what not to do with me speaking here. But it really is pretty impressive. And it reminds me of just thinking, an old mentor of mine used to say that, most of us assume that in New York, that's where all the talent is. And, that's kind of where all the brains are. And these people must be, wildly, more intelligent than some of us. And, the truth is, it's like my mentor said, money is sent to New York. It's not made in New York, And so there's a lot of truth to that. So now I'm going to add, there's places like Zionsville, Indiana, where I've found a great money manager, or Artesia, New Mexico. I'm going to add Seguin to that list because it really is an interesting phenomenon to think that, in New York they have all this talent, and the reality is it's less than you think it is. Today I'm going to start off the first maybe 15 minutes talking about mistakes that I've made and thinking about mistakes. And I think you learn a lot more from mistake than you do from success. And in all honesty, a lot of success is just right place, right time. So, when people start talking about success, you kind of wonder, well, how'd they get there? I mean, in all honesty. So I'm going to start talking about my mistakes, and then I will jump into an investment checklist and showing you how that's a good tool to value a business. So let me start with mistakes. So initially, whenever I made a mistake, I beat myself up. It was just like, what was I thinking? What am I? Why did I do that? And so when I made this mistake, I was kind of losing this opportunity because mistakes are actually a very good thing. Mistakes actually are telling you that you're progressing. You're doing things. I mean, if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing anything. And so I started changing my attitude towards mistakes, because I said, if I'm not making mistakes, I'm just really not progressing. And my goal became, with mistakes, I said, whenever I make a mistake, my goal is I want to start to recognize it a lot quicker than I usually do and recover from it. I mean, even today, it's very hard. I make a mistake and, I still beat myself up, but at least I've got kind of this roadmap. And more importantly, I want to learn from my mistakes, so that's the most important, because you're not going to progress unless you're learning from them. So I've started, my prescription now with the mistake, a big one. We all make tons every day, but if it's a big one, is I usually look for a rule that I want to implement, that'll help me avoid that mistake in the future. So I'll give you an example. I had a hard time early on, and still somewhat, speaking my mind. And sometimes I was in a bad mood or emotionally, not in the best frame of mind, and I would tell somebody, something that would offend them in a very bad way, as happens to a lot of us. So I'd lose my temper. And, inevitably, after I did this to somebody, I'd run into them probably every other day. I'd find out that their cousin is a potential, brother-in-law. I mean, I couldn't get away from them. So I said, I've got to stop making this mistake. And so I'm a big fan of Charlie Munger, and some of you know who he is. And one of the things I liked, one of the quotes Charlie always gives is he says, "You can always tell somebody to go to hell tomorrow." And so I started thinking, okay, well, here's my rule, I've now got my rule that I could always tell somebody to go to hell tomorrow. And it's hard, emotions are hard to keep, but I will, from now on, I feel like I need to tell somebody, something. I do stop myself. I kind of try to distract myself and get away from it. I do compose the email, and that I want to speak my mind, and then I wait. I say I'm gonna send this tomorrow. I'm gonna hit the send button tomorrow. And so usually the second day, as I'm reading this email, it's very embarrassing, because it's just unbelievable what I'll write, and it's a good thing because it's like, you are the worst human being. You are a despicable creature. You don't deserve to have children because you're a whore. I don't want your genes, just very bad stuff. So it's just good that I read this and I go, what was I thinking? How could I think this? And it's helped me. Now I'm going to talk about, I want to choose a real big mistake to talk about. And I'm going to talk to you about a mistake that I've made in my life that really was more of a habit that cost me the most time and money ever. And time, money you can always you could always get back. I mean, you can always recover. But time, that's a finite asset. So you really don't have it. So I'm going to give you a little personal example kind of leading into this mistake that I made. But it was just one big, and it was really this habit. And it's not alcoholism or drugs or anything like that. But the effects are surprisingly quite similar to that. So when I first started in investing, I had what you would call true passion. And what this meant is I just loved learning anything about business. It was really just an interest in business. And I had, if there was a book about investing, I wanted to read it. I'd read it on the weekends. So I really was interested in investing. And then that led to, well, maybe I should talk to other people in the investment field, maybe learn how they apply investing and learn from them. And so I started networking with a lot of different investment managers. And, I was always asking them, how do you invest? How do you look at how do you look at the balance sheet? What's your style of investing? What should I do? And I was learning from them. And I was very focused on learning, so my focus was outward. It was really about learning what they were doing. Over time, as more time went, and I started meeting more investment managers, and I met investment managers kind of close to my age, my thinking started changing a little bit, where instead of learning from them, I started kind of worrying about their success. All of a sudden I started kind of thinking, that person really doesn't deserve, the success they have, and started kind of having these negative thoughts, and I started having sometimes like ill will towards them, kind of like I didn't want good things to happen to them. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to let you all kind of tell me, if you can guess what habit I fell into, and I'm going to give you two clues. One, it's one of the 7 sins, and it's the one with no upside. So does anybody know which one it is? No upside, but it's the 7th sin. Close. Envy. So I fell into envy. Envy is this horrible thing that it's an inevitable part of life, but envy makes you do a lot of stupid things, and if you can avoid it, it's funny, I once got an opportunity to ask Warren Buffett, what one character trait he had that made him so successful, and this was at some dinner that I was at with another company. And he said, I never had envy, and I never am envied. So he goes both ways. He said, I never had envy. And by not having envy, what happens is you have the ability to focus on what's important. Because envy really just makes you waste a lot of productive time. Like I said, of the 7 sins, there's there's upside to gluttony, and some of you may debate me, there's lust, there's upside to all these other sins. But when you hit envy, there's absolutely no upside to it, and it's unproductive time. You're wasting a lot of time. And it took me away from my true passion. So let me give you an example. I started, it made me do things that weren't really me, because I started worrying about, kind of like, well, if they can do it, I need to do it. So for example, I met with a family office to raise money from, basically a wealthy individual's, group of individuals that manage that person's office. And I left that meeting going, wow, I don't want to raise any money with these people. They're a bunch of jerks. I don't want to work for them. I don't want to answer their phone calls. So I meet with an investment manager that I had envy with, somebody, and it's usually when it's close in age. And, he tells me he raises $50 million from them, and I'm like, well, I need to go raise $50 million from them. So I started changing myself, to fit the criteria that I thought they were looking for. And so that's the one dangerous thing about envy is there's no, it's the worst human emotion that'll make you do things that just are not you. And so as I'm thinking about envy, you always hear that quote that says, be yourself. And it's like, well, what's that mean? That sounds fine and all, but be yourself just means that really if you are yourself, you self-select into opportunities. So self-selection is very important because when I had this envy and I changed myself for to meet the criteria of what I thought somebody else was looking for, I may trick them, initially, but I paid down the road. I basically, at some point they discover that you aren't what you presented to be, and I'm saying it's not about lying or anything like that. It's just changing who, like for example, there's an investment manager that didn't disclose his holdings, and I've always disclosed my holdings, and he would tell me, Mike, you gotta be black boxy with these people because if you're not, they're going to just think you're a freebie and they're not going to want to invest with you. So, all of a sudden I started, kind of being, not disclosing my holdings as much as I used to, and I lost my current clients. So envy was just kind of the one theme running through all this. So what do you do? One, again, self-selection is very important, and we all encounter rejection, and we all kind of really look at rejection as a bad thing. But my view of rejection is that's really just saying you're not self-selecting in with somebody. In other words, it's a good thing, because and the earlier you get it, the better. Because it's not something that's, usually when I used to get rejected, I would think there's something wrong with me, like I'm not as smart as the other candidates, or I'm not, there's something up with me that I need to change. And the reality is it's more of a, you really just need to kind of have this authenticity about you, because rejection is saying you're just not fitting in that group, which is okay. It's not a bad thing. Second way to fight envy, or one way I think of fighting envy is whenever you find yourself competitive with somebody, and there's a certain kind of competitive where you don't want success for them, I would say get away from that individual, because it's very hard to it's hard to do it, but there's two types of competitive. A lot of people say it's good to be competitive, and I agree with that, but there's a caveat to that. I have in my industry what I call noble competitors. So there is this investment manager that I've actually sent money to in Zionsville, Indiana, and his name's Brad Leonard, and I think he is one of the best investors I've ever met. Now, Brad, I love hearing how great Brad is doing. I want Brad to be successful. Somebody wants to hurt Brad, I'm angry about that. But Brad just beats the pants off my record. Just consistently, year after year. And he is a noble competitor because he makes me want to be better, but at the same time, I also want Brad to be doing really well, because the day that Brad starts not doing well, I'm actually going to be kind of sad, because he's kind of my bogey, he's really helping me improve. Versus, say, in the past, when I was competitive with somebody, I wasn't, again, the envy had set in, and I wasn't focusing on what was important, and that's whenever you find yourself kind of not wanting their success, that's a dangerous thing. So, get away from that person. That's kind of a start. Second is you've got to realize that a lot of success in life is right place, right time. I think people really underestimate this. A lot of, when people say, oh, well, how did you get the success in this? I feel like saying, And the truth of the matter is, it's just right place, right time. I happen to know this individual, and this person was looking for a money manager, and it was right place, right time. It had nothing to do with characters of habit that I had, or it was just good timing. So a lot of times when you see success and you envy it, how did that person get so big? You see that in the tech world. Some of these young kids that just come out with billion-dollar fortunes just overnight. It's just about timing. So you got to put things in perspective. Third thing, and I think is the most important, is you really, as students, you really have to look for your passions in life. Because there's something about people that are very passionate in what they do, is they don't really have emotions like envy because they're so focused on what they're passionate about. Kind of like when I first started in the investment management business before I got derailed. You're just very outward looking. You really don't care if somebody's a jerk. You're learning. You're just really passionate about your subject. And there's a big difference between, say, passion and interest. And you have to differentiate between both of those because, for example, my dad was in the oil and gas business, and I had an interest in oil and gas. I did. It's very interesting. I like learning about geology. But I was never reading books on the weekend about geology. I was not reading I wasn't watching videos online about oil wells. And that showed to me that I'm just interested in this area, not passionate. Now investing, on my free time, I'm reading all the books. So as you're finding your passion, look to see where you really, where you're spending your free time learning about something. Because why is passion important? If you boil it down, passion is the fuel. The way I look at it, it's the gasoline for tenacity. And tenacity is what makes you successful, just barreling through something. So you need that fuel to keep you interested. So say I entered the oil and gas business. I don't think I would have been very successful in that business because when I have setbacks, I don't know if I would have had that tenacity to push through that. I think I probably would have found another field to go into. So really, if you look at it, passion is this fuel that really is for the tenacity that helps you push through it. So for example, I've got a lot of egg in my face recently. I have a problem of over-allocating in my fund. So for example, the investments I make, the ones that I think are going to work out in the near term, it's the opposite, and the ones that I think are going to work out in the long term, it's the opposite. So for example, I was investing in Cemex, and the stock got to $250 a share, and I made it 2% of my fund, and I said, I'm going to build into this because they have a lot of headwinds, They have a lot of problems, and I'm going to have a long time to build into this. And so I make it a small position at that price. And then I start investing in a company called Strayer, a for-profit education company. And I start buying at 120, and I'm buying all the way down to 70. And I'm like, at 70, this thing will probably double in the next year. Well, I was completely wrong. It's like the absolute opposite. Cemex quadrupled, and Strayer has come down. So I've had a pretty big setback, but I'm solving this problem. Because I have a passion in investing, I'm out there meeting with a lot of investment managers. I'm asking them for advice on portfolio allocation. I'm learning a lot about that subject. So that tenacity is just going to help me kind of come through the solution. Incidentally, it's kind of funny. There's a friend of mine that would always ask me, Michael, what is your lowest conviction idea right now in your portfolio? Because he figured out anytime I did a 2% position, it was a guarantee to work out in the short term. And anytime I did and then he'd ask me, what's your highest conviction? And I think he shorted, I'm not sure. But I really, I caught on to him, which was I kind of started giving him really crazy ideas, like, I think Amazon's, going to double from today, a low conviction idea. And he'd come back and say, I don't know, Michael, where do you see this low conviction in? But that's kind of what had happened. Now I'd like to transition over to talking about an investment checklist. And I have, here's kind of, I guess, do you mind passing this out, or should I just kind of move it? That's kind of so an investment checklist, changing topics now, is really a tool to value a business. And the reason it's a tool to value a business because it's really a compilation of questions that help you understand about the stability of earnings. So when you value a business, really to understand value of anything, a piece of real estate, or if you're valuing anything, valuing the school, it's about understanding what are the earnings of that business or the free cash flows. And the most important question is, how can they change in the future? So what is the stability of that? So the checklist is this basically just lots of questions that help you understand the stability of earnings. So there's questions on there like, what type of sales does a business make? Well, is it recurring revenue type business, or is it one-time sales? So a recurring revenue business would be a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. One-time sales would be patio furniture. So a business that sells patio furniture is a lot harder to value than the Wall Street Journal, where you have these prepaid subscriptions and you pretty much know, what the recurring, their 80% retention rate. I mean, you get a better idea of value knowing that just very simply the type of sales a business makes. Versus patio, you're winning customers every day. I mean, that's a very hard bit. I just don't, it's hard to predict how many customers are going to be coming in. Is there going to be a new competitor? I mean, it's a lot harder. Another question would be, what are the future growth opportunities? I mean, that's very important. Is this a business that's growing, or is it one that's already pretty mature? I think of WD-40, which is the lubricant company, the spray can. It's a very mature business. And so when you're valuing that business, you start thinking, well, I mean, this is not something that's going to be increasing its earnings, so it's going to have to be getting increasing earnings from two other places, perhaps acquisitions or perhaps from cost cutting. So it kind of leads you to what you should be paying attention to. Now, the main thing I learned is, as I'm answering these questions, and this is, I think, what a lot of analysts miss in intelligent New York, is valuation is actually very dynamic. I don't think there is at least I haven't succeeded in doing this, there's not one value. It's a range of values. Because if you change one factor in a business, it could have profound consequences on it. Now, some businesses that have, say, a big competitive advantage, like a Coca-Cola, you could mismanage that for a long time, as it has been, and really there hasn't been a lot of destruction of value there. But other businesses, it has a more profound impact. So a recent example is when JCPenney, the CEO of JCPenney, Ron Johnson, when he came in to manage that business. Now, if you looked at his background, this is before JCPenney, after we see what happened. I mean, here's the CEO who built Apple stores, and he hired these great employees. And I mean, he had this phenomenal track record at Apple. And then he comes to JCPenney, and within really about 8 months, he succeeded in decreasing their sales by 25%. And in retail, I mean, JCPenney it didn't take a lot of investment decisions on his part to decrease it. And now JCPenney's stock has dropped, to these great, and he's been, ousted. So valuation's dynamic, it changes. And so this is the big advantage of this checklist, is that it gives you, I think the first big advantage is it gives you this holistic view of a business, of the value of a business, because you're examining a business from a lot of different angles. You're not looking at it just from one angle. So early on in my career, and maybe in yours, you spend a lot of time determining if a business has a competitive advantage, and maybe 70% of your time is spent on this. But the reality is most value is created as an advantage is being built, not after it already has one. A business already has one. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, the biggest gains in Microsoft were as that advantage was developing, not after it already had one. So by looking at the business in a more holistic view, you could start learning. You don't just focus in one area. So I found it useful from that standpoint. The second big advantage, and to me the biggest, is you know the risks you're taking in an investment by the questions that you're able to answer, but more importantly, by the questions you're unable to answer. So that's the most important part. Like, what can't you answer? So, for example, I remember prior to the financial crisis, say, I think in 2006 or 2007, I was reading the 10K of AIG, and I saw AIG's in your all's fund. And at that time, as I was reading through the 10K, one of the questions on my checklist is a very simple question. How does the business make money? Very simple question. How does a business make money? And I think it's very overlooked, by the way. Nobody really asks that question, but it's a good question. So I sat down to write down, because I like writing. I think it's a very good way to learn. I started writing down, well, how does it, trying to map out how AIG makes money. And so I understood some of it. It's an insurance company, and and then you look at what they're earning on their investments. But then as I started getting further and further, I couldn't answer this question. I just really couldn't answer. And I started reading sell-side reports and talking, talking to some of the analysts going, how does AIG make money? They could, same as me, they got to that point, but then they're like, well, there's these other products that they really don't give you a lot of disclosure on, but but it's like, okay, yeah, but that's like 60% of their profits, So I think it's important, but I couldn't answer this question, so I go, as much as I think it's cheap, at that time I thought it was cheap, I'm just not going to make this investment. And so just by not being able to answer this question, I avoided a big mistake, because later we find out nobody knew how AIG made money. So I was able to pass on it. So third big advantage is checklist is a great feedback mechanism, because as you're answering these questions, it becomes sort of a written report, and so what you're doing is you're kind of, and what happens is when I say feedback mechanism, is you could always look back to see what you thought about a certain investment so that you can improve in the future. So for example, in my case, I had a big problem in understanding operating leverage. Basically a business that has a high fixed cost structure, like an airline. Let's just think of a plane. It's got when that plane takes off, it takes off with a certain cost structure, and it's a high fixed cost structure. It doesn't change. And what the effect of a change in revenues would have on the bottom line. So looking back at my reports, I would see that, okay, I'm looking at this high fixed cost business, and I projected that if revenues dropped 10%, that the earnings would drop 20%. And what had actually happened is that the earnings dropped 90%, and this was a consistent problem. I mean, I still kind of have the problem, but by having these written reports, I'm able to see where I'm improving. Because if you think about investing, as a business, it's actually a pretty good business, because you're thinking. I mean, investing is a business of thinking, and your output is decisions. So anything that improves your decision-making ability, any tool you use, is really a good thing. So it's really critical for that. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how to answer the questions. Because it's not there is an art to answering these questions. One, the overriding theme is you want to take your personal assumptions out as you're answering these questions. What you think. You like Nike shoes and you think everybody else does. That's where I've made the biggest mistake. So you want to take personal assumptions out, and you want to use two things. One is evidence. Evidence is like, what's the profit margin? What's the gross profit margin? Well, you can go look in the financial statements. That's evidence. Second one is track record. So if you're assessing the quality of a manager, and you say, well, he's good. Well, why? What's the track record that makes you answer that question? So I'll give you an example on both of them. I'll start with evidence. So I was once analyzing this company called Bulldog Electric, and they're an electric motor manufacturer based in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And the CEO, I got to know him really well. It was a great culture business. Invited me to Fort Smith and said, we're having a customer event, and we're going to have all our distributors, we're going to have our customers, we're going to have our top management, and you're going to learn a lot about the business. Why don't you come down? And I said, that's great. So we had these dinners, and one of the questions I had, in a business is, does your business have pricing power? And so, I'm sitting, and it's one of the questions I asked, just kind of generically, and I asked the customers, I asked the management, I asked the distributors, and all of them are saying, yeah, we do have pricing power. Of course we can raise the prices of these motors. And so a couple of years go by, and I actually learned that they don't have pricing power, and it's for a very limited set. And I really started questioning my ability to judge people, because Fort Smith, Arkansas is kind of like here. It's kind of Waffle House people that don't lie. They go to the Waffle House. It's how did they lie to me? And then the customers lied to me, the management lied to me, and the truth was, no, they hadn't. I used a personal assumption. I lied to me. I used a personal assumption that they had pricing power. But the evidence is very simply found in one place, which is actually publicly available to all of us. It's in the 10K. It's in the management discussion and analysis section, where management talks about the changes in the gross profit margin. And they say we raised, some companies like Compass Minerals, they say we raised prices by 5%, and this led to an X% increase in our earnings. Some just say, hey, we decreased prices and earnings went down. So that's where you see pricing power. So that was the evidence. So when I answered that question for Baldor, well, I used a personal assumption and not the evidence. Now with track record, I'll give you an example. I was looking at Western Union, which is a remittance company. You can send money to India or Mexico from the US and vice versa. And I was looking at this company as being spun off from First Data, and this was back in 2006. So one of my questions on my list with management is management a good capital allocator? By the way, I think this question is a little too overused in the business. And the reason is because if you're an operator of a business, like a day-to-day operator of a business, the question is how bad of a capital allocator you are. Because capital allocation and running operations are two completely different areas. I mean, it's like being an analyst and running a money management firm. One is about relationships, and the other one is about investing. It's just two different expertises. So anyways, I asked this question about the new CEO. Her name was Christina Gold, and she was coming out there. And I said, I just can't answer it. I don't have the track record. I don't know, because all the capital allocation decisions were being done at the First Data level. So I had to wait. So 2006, it spins off, 2006, 2007, and comes along, and I see that they're buying $1 billion worth of stock. So Western Union is a high free cash business. And, the stock price is 22, 26 a share, kind of in that range. And they're generating about $1 billion in free cash flow. And so, they're buying the stock. So then 2008 comes, and their stock drops to about $12 a share or 14, something like that. And immediately, management announces that they're going to cut back their share buyback authorization from $1 billion to $400 million. And so now, you could say, financial crisis, and that's what I said. I said, maybe their cash flows are going to drop a lot. But a couple of quarters go by, and I start seeing that revenues are not really changing that much. Maybe they're dropping 1%, 2%, and they still are just buying back less stock. So, in other words, they were buying back stock, say 6 months prior at prices over 24 a share, but now that the stock's at 12, they want to buy even less than half. That's a sign bad capital allocation. So right there, now I had the answer. I had the track record to be able to answer that question. So that's kind of your example of a track record. Now I'd like to talk about two areas. I'm going to transition. You've all heard of the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. I'm going to talk about what I think is the 20% that'll get you 80% of the results in investing. And they're the most overlooked areas in Wall Street. Wall Street just doesn't even pay attention to this stuff. And what it is one is understanding a business from a customer perspective, and the second is management. So I'll start with the customer perspective. So customers are the lifeblood of a business, right? They're the one stakeholder that determines whether your business exists or not, So what happens is most people are accustomed to looking at a business from their, again, personal assumption, their perspective, unless you're the customer instead of the customer perspective. And this is where analysts, investors make the most mistakes. They're doing it right now in for-profit education. Most analysts are Ivy educated. They've gone to Ivy schools, and they don't understand why somebody would go to the University of Phoenix. And so they're looking at, this industry is really beaten up right now, but there is this bias, that it's like, now that Dartmouth is starting an online program, University of Phoenix is toast, and it's like, well, you really don't understand this business, that's not what that's about. So I'll give you a good example of where that worked to my benefit. So I remember analyzing Whole Foods market, and they're based in Austin, but the thing is, I was not a customer of Whole Foods. I go to H-E-B, I'm not a Whole Foods customer, and so I said to myself, I better start understanding Whole Foods from the customer perspective, because I believe that Whole Foods at that time was a discretionary grocery store, that only affluent people would visit, but it was discretionary. It was a place just like I would shop it, at that time. I would go there for a few items, here and there, So I viewed Whole Foods as this business. And so then I said, well, how do you understand the customer perspective of a retailer? That's millions of customers. And so I noticed that they are a very decentralized business, and they're run by regions. So there's a regional president for each region. I said to myself, I'm going to go to each of these regional presidents and just call them up. And the better the company, by the way, the more accessible management is. And so I called them up, and I said, hey, listen, I'm trying to understand, what Whole Foods' customer is like. How would I go about that? And so this is, it's pretty simple. About 20% of our customers make up 80% of our sales, And furthermore, our customers are educated. It has nothing to do with income level. So we have teachers making $20,000 a year, and we have super wealthy people. It's an education thing. And I started going, gosh, what's that say about me? Yeah, I do go to Whole Foods all the time. But those were the two things. And so why is this important? So we started buying Whole Foods in 2007 at over $40 a share. And then the crisis comes, and the stock price starts tanking. Because for the first time in 25 years, Whole Foods reported negative same-store sales. So for 25 years, they reported same-store sales increases of 6%. It's really one of the greater retail growth stories out there. But it's negative for the first time. So the stock drops to almost $8 a share during 2008, very quickly. I mean, it just overnight just fell like that. And now I'm in a position of, do I buy more or what's going on? I already started buying at 40 and now you're at 8. And the thing is, all the Wall Street analyst reports at that time started saying two things about Whole Foods. One, they got scared by the negative same-store sales, but they used that as evidence to say that Whole Foods is one, it's a discretionary retail store, and we're about to enter a recession, and customers are going to abandon them in droves, because it's discretionary. Just like I thought. These Wall Street analysts were thinking, just like I was thinking. But I knew differently. I knew that there was a core customer of Whole Foods that was not going to go anywhere. These people were dedicated. I started knowing more of them. They were dedicated to organic eating, and they wouldn't even want to be caught dead in an H-E-B. I mean, if you understand it from their perspective, I mean, they're like, I don't even go to H-E-B. That's just disgusting. But they're not going to be going to other stores, and I knew this, and I knew that maybe there was on the fringe customers that were leaving them. So it allowed me to buy with conviction, as the stock price continued to drop, and it's been one of our best investments because I took the time to understand it from my, the customer perspective rather than my perspective. Now I'd like to, I guess, talk a little bit about management. To me, management is, and I'm biased, I think it's the most important thing in a business. It depends. If you have a Coca-Cola or a Microsoft that's a monopoly type business, again, like we said earlier, or I said earlier, the management team is not, if you have incompetent management, the business can survive it. But there is a reason Microsoft has not created value, and if you study it, it's Ballmer. Ballmer is not very good at recruiting talent, At the end of the day, he's just not. All the talent has gone to Google. And so when your talent leaves, how can you execute? You may have this grand plan of what you want to do. This happened to Ron Johnson at JCPenney. I knew JCPenney was doomed. One simple thing is when he joined, he started announcing change immediately. And I said, he just joined. He has no idea what kind of management team he has under him. The good CEOs, they come in, like I saw Storm Ruger do it, the gun manufacturer. The CEO came in and didn't announce anything. He actually went out and started visiting with all the gun owners and the gun stores and his people and just said nothing, and it was like a lot of analysts kept, what's your plan? What's your strategic plan? I don't have one yet. I don't have one yet. And it's hard to, it's just, Wall Street demands this big, I'm going to do and change, and I'm going to get rid of discounting. Well, yeah, Johnson, that's what the customer wants. You're going to get rid of what they want, smart. But Ruger, he thought about it a little bit closer. He said, I'm going to go out there and find out what I have to work with to execute. And so, one stock ends up, and there's been tailwinds with gun laws, but, he really did a big turnaround versus, say, a Johnson. So management is very important. Now, unlike locating customers, there's actually a lot of data in the public sphere about management. There's a lot of data out there. And, a lot of students, and I don't try to, I used to I was able to get access to management, but I actually meet management way later, and sometimes it's not, I already know so much about them from other areas that it's not as, productive. And in this business of seeing somebody eye to eye, that's a bad thing as well, because you have your biases, you have your background, you kind of choose people like you. I missed out on a lot of management teams because they had long hair, they were hippies, they didn't look like me. If I asked them, hey, what's return on capital? They'd kind of look at me and go, I don't even know what that is. And I'd just be like, oh gosh, this manager is an idiot. But if you asked them, how quickly do you get your money back on the store? It's like, a year. It's like, okay, that's pretty good. But it was just, so you have those biases. So there's a lot of public information. I'm going to tell you the sources. How many of you are familiar with Factiva? LexisNexis. So you have these in the library. These are basically a repository of articles. It's a database from the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Economist, local business journals, Austin Business Journal's in there, San Antonio Business Journal, local newspapers. So it just compiles. Factiva is a service that just compiles all these articles. And if you put in the name of the manager, next to the company name, you're going to get even managers that you think aren't that well known. There's tons of articles. It'll pull one out, and we do an unending search. And if they worked at another company, we search for that company, and so we just get this group of articles, that we put together, and you hear stories, problems that they've encountered, issues that they had, and you can see how they acted during that time. So one of my questions on my checklist is, does management have integrity? And fact of the matter is, you don't know whether anybody has integrity until they've been faced with what I call a moment of integrity. A difficult situation where integrity is questioned, and how did you act? So one of my favorite stories is I was studying a company called 99-cent only stores. It's private now, but it's a dollar store retailer based out of Los Angeles. And it's not a typical dollar store. I brought a picture, and you all can pass it around. This is a photograph of the store, except this photograph is the most expensive photograph ever sold, ever. This photograph is by a guy named Andreas Gursky, and it sold for $2.4 million, and it's basically the inside of a 99-cent only store. So I'll pass that along. So it's not your typical dingy dollar store. So I was very interested in this business. I went and visited it. And I started reading about the founder, and I started, and so I like to read the articles sequentially, like going back, to 1980, say, and moving up. And I'm reading about the founder, and I found out he's 55 years old when he starts 99-cent only stores. It's just amazing in itself. Like 55 years old just kind of gives me hope that, every time you fail, it's like, you can get back there. Age shouldn't make a difference. And I start reading. He lives in the same home. He drives the same car. And I like all this stuff. And then I start running into these articles about Dave, that he's being investigated by the SEC. And what had happened is that the SEC was accusing him of self-dealing. He had bought a business, so 99 owned a business that they had purchased 2 years prior, but Dave bought it back from the company. And so what had happened is the SEC said, Dave Gold, and even shareholders said, he's taking advantage, he's treating this as his personal piggy bank. I mean, and this is a person that was making $100,000 salary a year. So I just kind of said, wow, right when you think, here's a moment of integrity. I've answered the question, but gosh, you'd think, with those other lifestyle habits, he wouldn't be like that. So I kept reading, and as I started reading, 2 years later, I found out what really had happened. And when the SEC closed its investigation and everything had passed, what had happened is Dave made this decision to buy a New Jersey. They weren't even in New Jersey, but they bought this retailer in New Jersey. And Dave said, I was the first to think it was a success, but the last to think that it was a mistake. Everybody kept telling me it was a mistake. 6 months in, they said it was a mistake, a year. And it took me 2 years to realize that. And the article was about, Dave basically saying, I felt so bad for shareholders for screwing up so big that out of his personal pocket, he bought the business back. And he paid 2 times what 99 had purchased it for. And it's like, and the reason was because it had sustained operating losses. So there is a perfect example of a moment of integrity. I mean, I didn't need to know more about Dave. It's like somebody that does that, you don't need to know more. So that's where that comes in. Another thing we read the articles is we like to look at the lifestyles of CEOs. I mean, we go one step further and we like to see their homes, where they live. And especially with Google Maps, it's great, because you can just like, that's interesting, 20,000 square foot house. But we don't do it to be judgmental of a lifestyle. We just want to know where people's priorities are. It's not that somebody that lives in a 20,000 square foot mansion is a bad person. And in fact, I'm invested in a company where the CEO races Ferraris, but he's a fantastic CEO. So it's a good place to look for red flags because we're looking for extravagance and just where are the priorities? Because if you think about it, we're remodeling just a small part of our house. And there's a lot of time that's spent. I mean, it just shows where there's a lot of time spent on that facet, that rather than just say worrying about managing your business. So a story I like to tell is one of the best performing stocks, I think it was in the 80s and 90s, maybe you know, Dave, is Conseco. And it was run by a CEO called Stephen Hilbert. And Conseco for 10 years compounded at 46%. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, you do 46%, do $1, do it 10 years later, it's a big number. So 10 years, this company is compounding 46%. It's just, you know, goes up 100%, next year's up 50, then maybe one year, the worst year is 20. And all during this time, there was all these articles being written about Stephen Hilbert's personal lifestyle. You know, for example, he liked to play basketball with his friends. And so he decided, and it talks about this 40,000 square foot mansion that he was building and all the zoning wars he got in with his neighbors. And he wanted to build a replica of the Indiana Hoosiers basketball court in his home. I mean, this is a red flag, you know? I mean, it's just like, yes, the stock is doing great, but I mean, this is a red flag. But it was all out there. It was there in the public record for anybody to see, but people had just seen all this success. Conseco ended up being a fraud, by the way. But the signs are there. You know, the lifestyle, personal lifestyle gives quite a bit away. Another thing we like to kind of look through is that's available to all of you in here is the proxy statement. You know, you can all look it up. It's in the SEC website. And what I like to do is I jump straight to the bio of the management team. And my question is, how did they rise in the organization? And it's a question on the checklist. You know, how did they rise in the organization? Because I want to know what they were doing. So I'll give you an example. We were looking at Dr. Pepper Snapple. And when we were studying the CEO, Larry Young, we had seen that Larry's whole career was in operations. You know, he'd run bottling plants. He had worked on the trucking side. He was always in a customer-facing position. So Larry Young, his operations was just completely operations focused. And so this gives us, you know, just by reading the bio, and I mean, we also read articles to kind of fill in, you know, the rest of the history, but we go historically through proxies as well to kind of see what were their positions. Now contrast that to we were analyzing Cisco, the food distribution company. Anybody related to the CEO before I say something? Okay, this has happened to me. I learned, that's my rule, ask the audience, you know. So I look at and he's not a bad guy, but I look at his bio, and he used to be the CFO, okay? And then before that he was treasurer, and his whole career has been in the corporate suite. And he has never been in a customer-facing operations side. And the thing is, Cisco is a food distributor. I mean, they probably deliver food here. In fact, I know they do. And that is a very operations-oriented company. And your CEO has come up from the corporate suite. I mean, who would you rather partner with? You know, not judging the business. You know, the operations person, does they have more experience? In fact, when I met the CEO at a conference, I said, "Oh, are you visiting your plants here in Chicago, you know, your facilities?" And he's like, "No, I'm here for you guys. You know, I'm here to visit with you shareholders, you know." And I was like, "That's a bad sign." You know, that's not good. You know, you should be out there. But Cisco's gonna have less ability creating a lot of value with somebody like that, because that goes down to I mean, imagine working for a company like that and your CEO's in town and he doesn't even come visit your facility. And you know he's in town. You know, the corporate scuttlebutt works really well. So it's a really bad sign. Another thing we look at is we ask the question, are they product or sales focused, by looking at their bio. Steve Jobs is the epitome, or unfortunately, you know, as he passed, but he was a product focused CEO. And then the new CEO, I don't know why I'm drawing in. What's it? Okay, Tim Cook, yeah, is more of a sales-focused CEO. If you look at Tim Cook's background, it's more in sales. And why is this important? You know, the most value is created by these product-focused CEOs. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, in the 80s and early 90s, this was like one of the best-performing industries, you know, out there. And you know, over the last decade, even 15 years, maybe it's longer than that, it really hasn't created a lot of value. But if you go back into the 80s and you look at the CEOs who ran those companies, Merck, you know, Pfizer, They were all product folk. They were all scientists. They all had science backgrounds. They had been in the lab. They had worked their way up. They were product focused. They were worried about creating new products. And in fact, if you look at Merck specifically, most of their drugs, their big drugs, came about when this CEO named Vagelos was in charge, and he had been a scientist before. So all of his efforts were put into the science. Now later, all of a sudden in the 90s, I don't know why, but Merck decided to bring in somebody else that was a little bit more sales focused. He had run a medical devices company before that, but he had changed the emphasis of Merck from the science lab to more things like mergers and acquisitions. Like he started thinking, why do we need to, if you look at a lab and a pharmaceutical, all drugs are a mistake. I like to use this, but Viagra was a mistake. They didn't come out and say, we're going to do an erectile drug. Viagra, I forget what it was, but it was something completely unrelated to that. So all of these things are mistakes. And so as a CEO coming into this industry, you say to yourself, wow, you've got a big failure rate. I mean, all these things are accidents and so on. And so you're talking to your board and you're saying, we just can't be depending on accidents, And, but it's smarter. Why don't we do this? Why don't we start thinking about just buying drugs? Because that's a lot safer. We don't take the risk. It's a good argument. But over time, the pharmaceutical industry was replaced by scientists, by these M&A people, and there has been zero innovation in that. Every new drug is just a variation of an existing old drug. When you're looking at the CEO, and you really need to answer that question because it'll give you an insight into how the future is likely to occur. So again, this is all about trying to see, what's the future going to look like. Most stuff is not predictable, but some things you can kind of tell that they will be. We look at the compensation differences. In the proxy, they show the compensation differences amongst the 5 different executive officers, and if you go back and you look at Home Depot's when Nardelli came. You'll see he was making about 200, 300 times more than the next executive officer. So this is a signal that this company is very autocratically run. It's run for, it's just an autocratic type CEO. Versus if you look at some of the best performing long-term stocks, I'm talking over 25 years, like Fastenal, Expeditors, the compensation difference, the top 5 executives make about the same amount. There's really not a lot of variation. Even at Whole Foods, they all make exactly the same amount. So the CFO makes the same as the CEO and so on. They all make the same amount in the compensation. But this is telling you this is a team-based type environment, which is preferable to invest in. I haven't seen a lot of autocratic CEO companies work long-term. So it's a great signal. Another thing, is conference call archives. We all have access to them. I think they're free now. We subscribe to a service, but I think you can get them for free. And we like to specifically look at the years 2008 and 2009 because this was a very difficult period, and we like to see how the CEO or the management team, how they were answering questions. Are they giving you high content and good, like we don't know what the environment is going to bring, but this is what we can control. This is what we're going to be doing, or are they engaging in corporate speak? A lot of times I read these conference call archive, and I don't know what they said. I just read them and I go, I don't understand what you're talking about, and I don't learn anything. Same thing goes for a shareholder letter. I think one of the best shareholder letters I've read is from Strayer, talking about an operations-oriented CEO, not like Buffett. I think those are the best, but for an operations-oriented, because in his letter, Silberman, he describes the challenges they're having. He actually, on one page, just puts, this is how Strayer makes money. So he helped me answer that question real quick. He's like, we are a university. We take in students. We pay. It's a very simple explanation. But he goes through, in a shareholder letter, he goes through talking about the mistakes they've made, the things they will not sacrifice. What are the values of the company? Like, we're a student-focused business. What does that mean? That means we're not going to open campuses unless we have the talent to open them. So all that stuff is in there. And when I finish reading his letter, or his conference calls, I actually leave learning more about the business than versus other businesses. You read about them and it's just filled with all this other stuff that you just really don't know what you just read. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start kind of concluding a little bit. One, I really want to emphasize watch Envy. Because the super achievers don't really have the super. I should say consistent. Long-term achievers. They don't have it. I was just in New York meeting with a company called Brookfield, and their CEO is a 46-year-old that has just created tremendous value. I mean, he's worth $600 million personally. No ego. You know, he just really has no ego and no envy. I mean, it doesn't bother him that Bill Ackman is coming after his corporation, which he did. You know, Bill Ackman went after Brookfield. You know, I was there at that time, and he just kind of said, you know, I don't worry about that guy. You know, and he kept focusing. Most people would get into, well, I'm going to go fight Ackman, you know. So anyways, envy is a very dangerous emotion that'll distract you from focusing on what's important. And then, and one thing is, a checklist is a good tool, you know, as we've been, to really value a business, and just keep thinking of valuation in dynamic terms. Don't make the mistake I made for so many years thinking that there's one value. You know, if you can really, and also don't make the mistake of thinking you can predict, you know, because a lot is not predictable. So you really have to kind of think in ranges. You know, you really can't predict, but you know that in June it might rain, it might not rain. You got to be prepared for different scenarios. So a checklist helps you with that. So with that, I'll conclude and open it up to some. I hear some. Dave said some forced questions. You all have to ask questions. So there's nothing off topic. So I'll just open it up.
What made you so confident in Strayer? What did you see in their business model or whatever?
You mean overconfident? Yeah. Well, I've been overconfident in it, but. What I like is that it's a very customer-focused business, student-focused business. And when I say that, it's, for example, in this time period, one of the things Silberman did is he actually raised the standard. They're having a big enrollment problem, okay?